Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Shingler, Editor-in-Chief of Foreword Reviews, and you're tuning in to Petit Foreword, our bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today, we're talking to Julia Ridley Smith, author of The Sum of Trifles, a whimsical book that sifts through the stuff of an inheritance in search of peace. Its essays form around objects and oddities, each of which are addressed in the greater context of family stories, Southern history, and literary parallels. Julia, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
Your grieving process involved liquidating your parents' ample antique-filled home, a time-consuming process and one that forced you to reckon with a lot of memories. If your parents had been minimalists, how might that process have been different for you? And from this distance, how do you reckon with it now?
I feel that if my parents had been minimalists, obviously there would have been a lot less to do. And actually going through all of their things, they were antique dealers. They had collected a lot of antiques, as well as just sort of being pack rats of papers and things like that. Going through all of those things gave me this great opportunity to kind of process my grief by spending time with them through the objects, through the papers. I learned things about them that I didn't know, some things that were surprising. Other things were just kind of a window onto parts of their life that I maybe knew a little bit about, but I learned a lot more through going through the objects and the papers. And so I feel like if they had been minimalists, my job would have been a lot easier, but I also would have missed this great opportunity to kind of learn more about my parents. And like I said, to just spend time with them, which was what I was missing in my grief.
Yeah. You say that when people come to your home, you're happy to tell stories about its curios, partially as an invitation for them to share their own stories in return. What item in your home do people ask about the most, and what's its story?
So one of the things they ask about the most is a portrait of a little girl from the 19th century that I actually mention in the book. It's a portrait of my grandmother's grandmother when she was very small. Her name was Emma Wright Ridley. And that portrait is connected with one of the objects that I talk about in the book, which is a family quilt that was made by Emma's mother. And their family lived in Southampton County. And they were involved in the Nat Turner Rebellion and putting down that rebellion. And so that essay really looks at the history of my family in regards to slaveholding. And I think one of the reasons people are drawn to that portrait is because it's such a sort of cheerful looking picture. It's this rosy-cheeked little girl. She looks very sweet. And it's an interesting point of conversation because when I start to explain who she was and the connections there, it kind of takes us in a very different direction from what the picture, initially, why people are attracted to the picture initially. Yeah.
What item do you secretly hope people will ask about the most, and what's its story?
Well, I like it when people ask about photographs or pictures because then I get to talk about, people in my family. But one of the objects that I kind of get a laugh when people ask about is this sort of risque Chinese print of a couple, in their amours. And you don't really realize what's going on until you get very close to it. And so when people kind of lean in for a look, they get a little bit of a shock. And then the even better part is that my mother actually gave it to my husband as a gift early in our marriage, which was sort of unexpected. But my husband is a great blusher. And so I think she gave it to him just for the sheer pleasure of getting to see him turn beet red. So that's kind of a fun one when people ask me about that. I like to talk about that.
That's fantastic. I appreciated the fact that some of the mementos that you ended up keeping were themselves inherited items, like the mourning pin. What do you think that the items that we intentionally pass on from generation to generation, those bits that never get cold or make it to the estate sale, have to say about our families?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think, heirlooms really have to do with that passing down, and they gather value to families, the more generations they go through, right? So as these objects get passed down, they acquire lore, stories that go with them. And then sometimes the stories are lost, actually, and you don't even know why this thing is so special to your family. But the fact that the family has cherished it for so long is what then makes it important, right? And you feel this certain responsibility to continue to cherish that object because your ancestors have cherished it. And actually, that's kind of the case with the mourning pin that I talk about, which is an 18th century little painted enamel pin that was made for the purpose of kind of commemorating a grief. And I don't know why that particular pin was passed down. I don't know the person whose name is inscribed on it, but I know that because my mother inherited it from her mother, that I'm meant to cherish it as well.
So what do you think that line is? When does an item become an heirloom?
I think it has to do with that idea that, you know, somebody has decided that this object represents something important about our family, that if I don't hand it down, it could be lost, whether that it has to do with, you know, a person who's felt to be important in the family or just as much beloved, or whether that has to do with something cultural that you feel might be lost if you don't have an object kind of related to it that you can hand on to your children and grandchildren. So, you know, I think it has a lot to do with stories. And that's kind of when it starts to become an heirloom, is when you think, oh, I really want to make sure that future generations know this about our family. And this object seems like a good thing to represent that knowledge that I want to pass on to them.
Yeah. What do you wish you'd known about losing a parent in advance? And what's the best advice that you can give to those who are helping people through that same grief?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for advice for people dealing with someone in grief is really to be patient. You know, I find that as I've gone on and started to deal with other people who are dealing with griefs of their own, everybody kind of becomes in some ways more like whatever your not great quality is, you're probably going to have more of that. So if you're anxious, you become more anxious. If you're distracted, you become more distracted. So part of it's that patience. I think for me, the thing that I didn't expect quite was that the loss of my parents would be so destabilizing that destabilizing that I would feel that I had lost a part of my actual identity, that there was a role that I was now no longer called on to play because they were gone. And so part of grief is actually grieving for the part of yourself that you've lost when that beloved person dies. So it's not just that you're missing the person, but you're kind of missing that part of yourself that you were when you were with that person, or when that person was still around.
The book is a beautiful tribute to them and a lovely portrait of yourself from that perspective too. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, and to our audience for tuning in. Julia Ridley Smith's The Sum of Trifles is available in stores now, and it's definitely a book that you do not want to miss.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.